Daniel Carter woke to the sound of wind screaming against the metal walls of his station. He had been living on this mountain for 7 years now, and the wind never stopped. It howled through the peaks of Kepler 442b like a living thing, angry and cold and forever hungry. He rolled out of his narrow bed and walked to the small window that looked out over the ice fields below. The planet's sun was rising, casting everything in shades of blue and silver. Earth hung in the sky like a distant dream, just a bright star among millions. He could barely remember what it felt like to stand on that world anymore. The station was small, just 4 rooms carved into the mountain rock and reinforced with steel. There was his bedroom, a kitchen area, a workshop filled with mining equipment, and a greenhouse where he grew tomatoes and lettuce under artificial lights. It was enough. It had to be enough. Daniel had chosen this isolation carefully, picked this mountain because no one else wanted it, because the mining rights were cheap and the loneliness was free. After the bombing of Port Darwin, after watching his wife Lisa and his boy Marcus die in the flames, he needed emptiness. He needed a place where memory couldn't find him so easily. He pulled on his thermal suit and boots, then walked to the kitchen. The coffee maker was older than his settlement here, brought from Earth on one of the last colony ships. It still worked, grinding the synthetic beans and brewing something that almost tasted real. He drank it black and bitter, standing at the counter while his AI companion Boone ran diagnostics on the mining drones outside. Boone wasn't really alive, just a smart program housed in a maintenance drone, but Daniel talked to him anyway. It helped to hear a voice, even a synthetic one. The mining work was simple and repetitive. Daniel sent the drones down into the deep shafts where rare minerals grew in crystal formations. The drones cut and collected, brought everything back to the station where Daniel sorted and packaged it. Once a month, a cargo ship from the main colony came to pick up his haul and leave supplies. The pilot never stayed long, never asked questions. That was how Daniel wanted it. He had become a ghost, a man who existed only in shipping manifests and bank transfers. By noon, Daniel had processed 3 containers of mineral ore and was preparing to run a maintenance check on the eastern drill site. That was when Boone's sensors picked up something unusual. The AI's voice came through the station speakers, calm and measured as always. There was movement detected at the base of the southern ice field, approximately 6 kilometers from the station. The signature was biological, human-sized, and moving slowly. Very slowly. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, something he thought had died 7 years ago. Curiosity, maybe, or concern. He pulled up the sensor data on his workstation and studied the readings. Whatever was out there was barely moving, stumbling through terrain that could kill an experienced climber in minutes. No one came to this mountain. No one had any reason to. The main colony was 300 kilometers east, and the nearest outpost was even farther. This was the edge of nowhere, and Daniel had chosen it for exactly that reason. He stared at the screen for a long time, watching the signal move and stop, move and stop. He could ignore it. Should ignore it. Whatever was happening out there wasn't his problem anymore. He had left the world of people and their problems behind when he came to this mountain. He had earned his isolation with blood and grief, but the signal kept moving, kept struggling. And Daniel found himself pulling on his heavy environment suit before he could talk himself out of it. The suit was military grade, left over from his days in the colonial navy. It could keep him alive in temperatures that would freeze flesh in seconds, could filter toxic atmosphere and provide oxygen for 6 hours. He checked the seals twice, then grabbed his rescue sled and emergency medical kit. Boone transferred into the mobile drone unit, a small floating sphere with cameras and manipulator arms. Together they left the station and headed down the mountain path. The cold hit like a physical force even through the suit. The wind pushed against Daniel with enough strength to make each step a battle. The ice field stretched out below, a vast expanse of frozen methane and water that reflected the pale sunlight in blinding sheets. He could see the figure now, a dark shape against all that white, moving with the desperate slowness of someone at the absolute end of their strength. Daniel picked up his pace, pushing through drifts of frozen chemicals that rose to his knees. When he reached the figure, he saw it was a woman. She wore thin robes that looked ceremonial, completely inadequate for this environment. Her lips were blue, her skin gray with cold. Symbols were marked on her clothing, dark ink that stood out against the pale fabric. Daniel didn't recognize the writing, but something about it made his stomach turn. These weren't decorations. They were labels. Brands, almost. The woman's eyes fluttered open when Daniel knelt beside her. They were dark and clouded with hypothermia, but there was still something alive in them, still some core of will that had kept her moving when any sane person would have laid down and died. She tried to speak but only managed to whisper that the wind tore away. Daniel didn't waste time with questions. He wrapped her in thermal blankets from the emergency kit, then carefully lifted her onto the rescue sled. She weighed almost nothing, just skin and bone and stubborn refusal to quit. The journey back up the mountain took 2 hours. Daniel pulled the sled while Boone scanned ahead for safe paths through the ice. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes making small sounds of pain, sometimes silent and still. Daniel kept checking her vital signs with his suit's medical scanner. Her core temperature was dangerously low, her heartbeat irregular. She needed help fast, and his station wasn't equipped for serious medical emergencies. But it was better than the ice field. It was better than dying alone in the wind. When they finally reached the station, Daniel carried the woman inside and laid her on his bed. He cranked the heat up and started treating the frostbite on her fingers and toes. Boone prepared warm fluids and monitored her vital signs while Daniel worked. Hours passed. The woman's breathing steadied, her color improved slightly. She would live, probably, but she didn't wake, didn't speak. She just lay there, small and broken and marked with symbols Daniel didn't understand. He sat in his workshop that night, drinking coffee and staring at nothing. He had saved a life. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. For 7 years he had been alone, had wanted to be alone. Now there was someone else here, someone with a story written on her skin in ink and suffering, someone who had walked into the killing cold wearing nothing but shame. Daniel looked at Earth in the sky through his workshop window. The bright star seemed to look back at him, patient and waiting. He had run to this mountain to forget, to hide from being human, but humanity had found him anyway, half frozen and desperate at the base of his mountain. He couldn't ignore that, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen. The wind howled and the woman slept, and Daniel sat awake, keeping watch over a stranger who had changed everything without saying a single word. The woman slept for 2 days. Daniel checked on her every few hours, making sure she was still breathing, still fighting. He changed the dressings on her frostbite wounds and kept her hydrated with small amounts of water and nutrient solution. Boone monitored her vital signs constantly, reporting any changes in that calm mechanical voice that Daniel had learned to trust. On the morning of the 3rd day, her eyes opened. She stared at the ceiling for a long time before moving her head to look around the room. Daniel was sitting in the corner reading an old book on his datapad. He had positioned himself where she could see him, but far enough away that he wouldn't seem threatening. He had learned some things in the war about how to approach people who had been hurt. You gave them space. You let them see you clearly. You didn't make sudden moves. The woman's eyes found him and something flashed across her face. Fear maybe, or resignation. She tried to sit up and winced at the pain from her frostbitten extremities. Daniel set down his datapad and spoke quietly, keeping his voice gentle. He told her she was safe, that she was in a mining station on Ridge Peak, that he had found her in the ice fields 3 days ago. He asked if she remembered anything. The woman's hand moved to her throat, touching it carefully like she was checking to see if her voice still worked. When she spoke, her words were barely audible. She said her name was Helen Park. She said she came from New Prosperity. Then she stopped talking and looked at Daniel with eyes that expected punishment. He recognized that look. He had seen it on prisoners of war, on civilians who had lived under occupation. It was the look of someone who had learned that speaking brought pain. Daniel didn't push. He offered her water and she drank it slowly, her hands shaking. He told her his name and explained that she could rest as long as she needed. He said there was food when she was ready, medicine for the pain. He didn't ask questions. He just gave her information and space and then returned to his corner with his datapad. After a while, Helen closed her eyes again, but Daniel could tell she wasn't really sleeping. She was thinking, processing, trying to understand where she was and what would happen next. Over the following week, Helen's body healed faster than her spirit. The frostbite receded, leaving her fingers and toes sore but functional. She could walk without help, could eat solid food, but she moved through the station like a ghost, silent and careful, always watching Daniel as if waiting for him to transform into something cruel. She washed dishes without being asked, organized his workshop, tried to make herself useful. It was the behavior of someone who had learned that value came only through service. Daniel continued his mining work and tried to give Helen room to breathe. He showed her where everything was in the station, told her she could use whatever she needed. He set up a privacy screen in the bedroom so she would have her own space. He played music sometimes, old songs from Earth that filled the station with sound that wasn't wind. Slowly, carefully, Helen began to relax. Not fully, not completely, but enough that she sometimes met his eyes when they spoke. It was Boone who finally broke through her silence. The AI drone was checking the greenhouse systems one afternoon, while Helen was sitting nearby, watching the tomato plants grow under their artificial lights. Boone made a comment about the temperature regulation, and Helen responded without thinking. It was just a simple observation about plant care, but it was the first time she had spoken without being asked a direct question. Boone continued the conversation in his calm, mechanical way, discussing growing cycles and nutrient levels. Helen talked back, her voice gaining strength. Daniel listened from the workshop and felt something unknot in his chest. Helen wasn't broken. She had been bent and hurt and marked, but something essential remained. She could still talk about tomatoes. She could still think about living things and how to help them grow. That evening, Daniel made dinner for both of them. Something fancy, just protein paste reformed into something resembling chicken with rice and vegetables from the greenhouse. He set 2 places at the small table and asked Helen if she would join him. She hesitated, then nodded. They ate in silence for a while, but it was a different kind of silence. Comfortable, almost. Then Helen started talking. The words came slowly at first, like she was testing each one before releasing it. She told Daniel about New Prosperity. She explained how it had been founded 80 years ago by colonists who rejected what they called the weakness of Earth's egalitarian society. They wanted to build something pure, something strong. They created a hierarchy based on bloodlines and gender. Men ruled, women served, and the purpose of women was singular and absolute. They existed to bear sons. Helen had married young because she had no choice. Her husband was 20 years older, a man of some status in the colony. She did everything right, followed every rule, and then she gave birth to a daughter. Then another. Then a third. 3 daughters in 5 years, and the colony's patience ran out. The leaders declared her barren of valuable children. They took her daughters away to be raised by families who had proven their worth by producing sons. Helen was stripped of her status, her name, her rights. She was marked with symbols of shame and cast out beyond the colony walls. They called it returning the barren to the stone. It was supposed to be a death sentence. Women cast out rarely lasted more than a day in the harsh environment. They died of cold or hunger or the toxic atmosphere in the lowlands. Their deaths served as warnings to other women. Bear sons or become nothing. Helen had walked for 3 days, driven by rage and grief and a stubborn refusal to give her tormentors the satisfaction of an easy death. She had aimed for the mountains because mountains meant stone and ore and maybe someone who worked in isolation and didn't follow New Prosperity's rules. When Helen finished talking, her hands were shaking again. She looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. She asked what he would do with her now. Would he send her back? Would he keep her as a servant? Would he use her and then discard her like everything else in her life? Her voice was flat when she asked these questions, like she was discussing the weather and not her own fate. Daniel felt anger rise in him, hot and sharp, not at Helen, but at the people who had taught her to ask such questions, at the colony that had turned human beings into commodities, at the cruelty that wore the mask of righteousness. He took a slow breath and spoke clearly. He told Helen that she wasn't going back to New Prosperity. She wasn't going anywhere unless she chose to. She could stay here as long as she needed, as long as she wanted. This was her home now if she wanted it to be. He wasn't her owner or her master or her husband. He was just a man who lived on a mountain, and there was room for 2. Helen stared at him like he was speaking a language she had forgotten. Tears ran down her face and she made no sound, just cried silently while Daniel sat across from her and felt helpless. He didn't know how to fix what had been done to her, didn't know how to give back the years and the children and the dignity that had been stolen. All he could offer was space and time and the simple promise that no one would hurt her here. After a long time, Helen wiped her eyes and spoke again. She asked about Earth. She asked if it was true what the old stories said, that on Earth women could speak and learn and choose. Daniel nodded. He told her about the world he had left behind, where people were judged by their character and choices, not their gender or their bloodline, where children belonged to their parents, not to the state, where cruelty was challenged, not codified into law. Helen listened like he was describing heaven. Then she asked the question that changed everything. She asked if he thought it was possible to go back. If someone like her, marked and shamed and cast out, could ever see Earth again, could ever walk under that sky and breathe that air and maybe, possibly, be free. Daniel looked at this woman who had walked through hell in thin robes, who had survived what was meant to kill her, who still had hope buried somewhere under all the scars. He thought about his ship, the wayward sun, sitting in its hangar bay gathering dust. He thought about running away versus running toward something. He thought about Marcus and Lisa, and how they would want him to answer this question. He told Helen yes. Yes, it was possible. Yes, he could take her there if she truly wanted to go. The ship still worked. The drive still functioned. Earth was 300 light years away, but it could be reached. The journey would be dangerous and there would be complications, but it could be done. He could take her home. Helen closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had changed in her face. Something had caught fire. She looked at Daniel and said 3 words that would reshape both their futures. She said, "My daughters live." The next morning, Daniel stood in the hangar bay of his station looking at the wayward sun for the first time in 3 years. The ship was small, built for mining operations and short cargo runs, but it had a functional faster-than-light drive and enough living space for maybe 6 people if they didn't mind being cramped. Dust covered every surface and some of the external panels showed wear from the harsh mountain environment, but the core system still powered up when Daniel ran his diagnostics. The ship would fly. The question was whether it would survive the journey to Earth. Helen stood beside him, staring at the vessel with wide eyes. She had never been on a ship before, had never left New Prosperity's surface. Her whole life had existed within a radius of maybe 50 kilometers. Now she was looking at a machine that could cross the galaxy, and Daniel could see both hope and terror fighting for control of her expression. He explained what needed to happen next, keeping his voice calm and practical. They would need to prepare the ship, stock it with supplies, plan their route. But before any of that, they needed to talk about her daughters. They returned to the station's kitchen and Helen told Daniel everything she knew. Her eldest daughter was named Claire, now 12 years old. The middle child was Emma, 10. The youngest was Sophie, only 8. They had been taken when Sophie was 3, removed from Helen's home by colony security while she screamed and fought. She hadn't seen them since. She didn't know which families had taken them, didn't know if they were together or separated. All she knew was that children removed from shamed parents were housed in the communal dormitories near the colony center until they came of age and were assigned to proper families. Daniel listened and made notes on his datapad. He pulled up everything he had on New Prosperity's layout, which wasn't much. The colony was insular and paranoid, didn't share information freely. But Daniel had military training and access to old survey maps from when the colony was first established. He started building a picture of the place. New Prosperity sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, built partially underground to protect from the planet's harsh weather. The population was around 8,000 people. Security was tight but focused outward, watching for threats from the wilderness. They wouldn't expect an infiltration from someone they thought was dead. Over the following days, Daniel and Helen planned. It was slow work because Helen had to fight through years of conditioning that told her she shouldn't speak, shouldn't plan, shouldn't believe she deserved her children back. But Daniel was patient. He asked questions and listened to answers and slowly helped Helen remember that she was more than what New Prosperity had called her. She was a mother. She was a survivor. She was someone who had crossed an ice field in ceremonial robes because dying on her own terms was better than dying on theirs. In the evenings, they took breaks from planning to just exist. Daniel showed Helen his collection of books from Earth, hundreds of stories stored in digital format. She had never been allowed to read anything except approved religious texts in New Prosperity. Now she consumed novels and histories and poems like a starving person discovering food. She asked Daniel about Earth constantly. What were the cities like? What did the ocean sound like? Did people really choose their own partners? Did women really work alongside men, learn alongside men, lead alongside men? Daniel answered every question honestly. He told her about the Earth he remembered, flawed and complicated but fundamentally committed to the idea that every human being had value. He told her about his wife, Lisa, who had been an engineer, one of the best in the colonial fleet. He told her about Marcus, who had loved dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist, even though there were no ancient Earth creatures to study on the colony worlds. He told her how the separatist bombing had taken them both, how he had survived by pure chance because he had been working late at the naval yard. Helen listened to these stories and offered her own in return. She talked about her life before marriage, when she was just a girl growing up in New Prosperity's strict hierarchy. She had been taught from birth that her worth came from obedience and fertility, but she remembered moments of rebellion, sneaking books from the library that weren't approved, asking questions in school that made the teachers uncomfortable, dreaming about the stars and wondering what existed beyond the valley. Those dreams had been beaten out of her slowly, through shame and punishment and the constant message that curiosity was sin. But they hadn't died completely. They had just gone dormant, waiting. Boone participated in these conversations too, offering observations in his mechanical way. The AI had been programmed with extensive cultural databases and could provide context about Earth society that even Daniel had forgotten. Helen was fascinated by Boone, kept asking him questions about his existence. She had never imagined that a machine could think, could help, could be something almost like a friend. In New Prosperity, technology was functional and nothing more. The idea that someone could build an intelligence just to have company, just to not be alone, was revolutionary to her. 3 weeks after Daniel had found Helen in the ice, he took her outside the station on a clear day when the wind had died to almost nothing. They suited up and climbed to the highest peak accessible on foot. From there, they could see across the mountain range to the valley where New Prosperity sat in the distance. It was just a cluster of lights against the darkness, small and isolated. Helen stared at it for a long time without speaking. Daniel stood beside her and waited. Finally, Helen turned to him and said she was ready. Ready to go down there, ready to get her daughters, ready to risk everything for the chance to give them a different life. She said she understood it might not work. She might die, Daniel might die, they might fail completely, but she had to try. She couldn't run to Earth knowing she had left her children in that place. Daniel nodded. He had known this was coming, had prepared for it. He told Helen about his plan. They would wait for New Prosperity's monthly devotional ceremony, when most of the colony gathered in the central temple for mandatory worship. That would give them a window of maybe 2 hours when the dormitories would be minimally guarded. Daniel had old mining charges that could blow doors, had his service weapon from the naval yard. Boone could hack into colony systems and create diversions. It was a bad plan with terrible odds, but it was better than nothing. They spent the next week preparing. Daniel taught Helen how to use the environment suits, how to read topographic maps, how to move quietly. He showed her basic first aid and emergency procedures. He explained what would happen if they got separated, gave her coordinates and backup plans. Helen absorbed everything with fierce concentration. She said very little during the training. Just learned and practiced and pushed herself harder than Daniel asked her to. On the last night before the raid, they sat in the greenhouse among the tomato plants. The warm light made everything feel gentle and safe, a sharp contrast to what waited for them tomorrow. Helen asked Daniel why he was doing this, why he was risking his life for her children, for a woman he barely knew. She said she understood why she had to go, but she didn't understand why he would come with her. Daniel thought about the question. He could have said it was because he was a good person, or because it was the right thing to do. But Helen deserved honesty, not platitudes, so he told her the truth. He said that for 7 years he had been waiting to die, not actively, not by his own hand but passively. Living alone on this mountain was a slow form of giving up, a way to exist without really being alive. Finding her had reminded him of something he thought he had lost. It reminded him that people needed each other, that isolation was a kind of death, that maybe he still had something to offer the universe besides refined minerals and bitter silence. He told Helen that saving her daughters wouldn't bring back Marcus and Lisa, but it would mean something. It would mean he hadn't completely given up on the human capacity to care for each other. It would mean that cruelty didn't always win, that systems built on hate could be opposed, even if just by 2 people, even if just for 3 children. It was small and maybe meaningless in the grand scale of things, but it mattered. It had to matter. Helen reached out and took Daniel's hand. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched him, and Daniel felt the weight of trust in that gesture. She told him she was grateful, that whatever happened tomorrow, she was glad she had stumbled toward his mountain instead of dying in the ice. She said she had forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a person instead of a failure. She said if they died tomorrow, at least she would die trying. At least her daughters would know somehow that she had come back for them. Daniel squeezed her hand gently and promised they wouldn't die. He promised he would get her to her daughters and then he would get all of them to his ship. He promised that in a few months they would stand on Earth and feel real wind, not the artificial atmosphere of a colony. He made these promises knowing he couldn't guarantee any of them, but making them anyway because hope was a choice and Helen deserved to have it. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed behind the privacy screen and listened to Helen breathing on the other side of the room. He thought about Marcus and Lisa, about... The proximity alarms woke Daniel before dawn. He was out of bed and at his monitoring station in seconds, pulling up sensor data with hands that remembered military efficiency. 3 vehicles were moving up the mountain access road, heavy transports built for rough terrain. They were still 20 kilometers away but climbing steadily. Behind them, Daniel could see the heat signatures of at least a dozen people. New Prosperity had sent hunters. Helen appeared at his shoulder, already dressed. She looked at the screen and her face went pale, but her voice stayed steady when she spoke. She said they were coming for her. The colony couldn't let an outcast survive, couldn't allow the possibility that someone might escape their punishment. If other women learned that Helen had lived, that she had found shelter, the whole system of fear would crack. They had to find her. They had to make an example. They had to prove that there was no escape from New Prosperity's justice. Daniel calculated timelines in his head. The hunters would reach his station in maybe 6 hours, probably less if they pushed hard. He and Helen could be gone in 1, could load the ship and lift off before anyone arrived. They could run. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But Helen was staring at the screen with an expression Daniel recognized. It was the same expression she had worn when she told him about her daughters. It was determination hardened into something unbreakable. Helen said she had to leave. She wouldn't bring this danger to Daniel's door, wouldn't let him suffer because he had shown her kindness. She would walk back into the ice fields and lead the hunters away. Maybe she would die. Probably she would die, but at least Daniel would be safe. At least he wouldn't pay for her mistakes. She started toward the door and Daniel caught her arm, gentle but firm. He asked if she remembered what he had promised. If she remembered what they had planned. Helen looked at him with confusion and something like pain. She said the plan didn't matter anymore, that New Prosperity was coming and there was no time. Daniel shook his head. He told her she was wrong. He told her there was exactly enough time. He said the hunters had made a mistake by coming to his mountain. They had given him a reason to act faster than planned, and sometimes faster was better. Sometimes you had to move before you were ready because waiting meant losing everything. Helen stared at him like she didn't understand. Daniel walked to his weapon locker and started pulling out equipment. He explained while he worked, his voice calm and focused. The hunters would reach the station in 6 hours. That gave Daniel and Helen 4 hours to reach New Prosperity, get to the dormitories, extract the girls, and get back to the ship. It was insane and probably impossible, but the alternative was giving up. The alternative was letting fear win. Daniel had spent 7 years giving up, 7 years letting fear win. He was done with that. He told Helen something he had realized during the night. He told her he had been thinking about this wrong from the beginning. He had been treating the raid on New Prosperity like it was separate from escaping to Earth, like they were 2 different missions. But they weren't, it was all one mission. The mission was getting Helen and her daughters away from cruelty and taking them somewhere safe. The hunters coming up the mountain just changed the timeline, made it urgent, made it now. Daniel looked at Helen and said the words that would change everything. He said he would take her home. Not someday, not eventually, today, right now. But first they had to go get her girls. Then they would run. Run fast and far and never look back. He asked if she was ready. Helen's hands were shaking, but she nodded. She said yes. She said she was ready. They had 1 hour to prepare. Daniel moved through his station with practiced efficiency, grabbing supplies and equipment. He loaded the wayward son with food, water, medical supplies, everything they might need for the journey to Earth. He armed the ship's basic defensive systems, checked the fuel cells, ran emergency diagnostics. Boone coordinated everything, managing a dozen tasks simultaneously while maintaining watch on the approaching hunters. Helen packed her few possessions, the clothes Daniel had given her and the books she had been reading. She moved like someone in a dream, still not quite believing this was happening. Daniel saw her hesitate at the door of the station, looking back at the small room that had been her sanctuary. He understood. This place had saved her life, had given her space to remember she was human. Leaving it felt like abandoning safety, but safety was an illusion. The only real safety was forward, was movement, was refusing to stop. They took one of Daniel's mining vehicles down the mountain, using a service road that ran opposite to where the hunters were climbing. The vehicle was slow but reliable, built to handle the worst terrain the planet could offer. Daniel drove while Helen sat beside him, clutching a datapad that showed the layout of New Prosperity. She had been studying it for weeks, memorizing every corridor and junction. Now those memories would be tested. The journey down took 90 minutes. Daniel pushed the vehicle as hard as he dared, knowing that every minute counted. Boone rode with them in his drone form, running constant scans of the area. The AI reported that the hunters had reached Daniel's station and found it empty. They were confused, radiating messages back to New Prosperity asking for instructions. That confusion would buy Daniel and Helen maybe an hour before someone figured out what was really happening. New Prosperity appeared in the valley below them like a wound in the landscape. The colony was built in concentric circles around a central temple, all gray metal and dark stone. Walls surrounded the outer ring, more for psychological control than actual defense. Guard towers stood at intervals, watching the wilderness beyond. Daniel had studied this place through his sensors for years without ever caring what happened inside those walls. Now he cared. Now it mattered more than anything. They left the vehicle 3 kilometers from the colony and proceeded on foot. Both wore environment suits with the identification markers removed. They looked like maintenance workers, anonymous and unremarkable. Daniel carried his service weapon concealed under his suit along with the mining charges. Helen carried nothing but determination. They walked steadily toward the walls, not hurrying, not hiding. Just 2 people going about their business. The guard at the outer gate barely looked at them. He was watching his monitors, probably tracking the hunting party on the mountain, probably bored with his duty. Daniel and Helen passed through the checkpoint and into the colony proper. The streets were empty, which made sense. It was devotional time, when all citizens were required to gather at the temple. The entire colony would be in one place for the next 90 minutes, singing hymns and listening to sermons about purity and strength and the proper order of things. Daniel and Helen moved through the empty streets like ghosts. They passed residential blocks and work facilities, all silent and still. Helen led the way, following the path she had memorized from the maps. The dormitories were near the colony center, close to where the important families lived. It was part of the psychology. The removed children were kept visible, a constant reminder to everyone of what happened when you failed to meet expectations. The dormitory building was 3 stories tall, built from the same gray metal as everything else. 2 guards stood at the main entrance, but they were focused on the street, not expecting trouble from inside the colony. Daniel and Helen circled to a side entrance that led to a maintenance corridor. Boone had already hacked the lock through the colony's network. The door opened silently and they slipped inside. The interior was cold and sterile, designed for function rather than comfort. Rows of small rooms lined the corridors, each one holding 2 or 3 beds. There were no decorations, no personal items, nothing that suggested children lived here. Helen moved through the hallways with her jaw clenched, rage and grief fighting for control of her expression. Daniel followed, keeping watch, his hand near his weapon. They found the girls on the 2nd floor. Claire and Emma were in one room, Sophie in another. Helen opened the door to Claire's room first and stepped inside. 2 girls sat on narrow beds, both with dark hair and their mother's eyes. They looked up at the sound of the door and stared at Helen without recognition. They had been 3 and 5 when she was taken from them. 7 years had erased her face from their memories. Helen knelt down slowly, keeping her distance, not wanting to frighten them. She spoke in a whisper, telling them her name, telling them she was their mother. The girls looked at each other, confused. Helen pulled back her sleeve to show them a small birthmark on her wrist, a crescent shape. She said Claire had the same mark on her shoulder. Emma had one behind her right ear. She said she had been there when they were born, had held them, had loved them before she was forced to leave. Claire stood up slowly. She was 12, old enough to remember fragments, old enough to have questioned the story she had been told. She pulled down the collar of her shirt to reveal the crescent birthmark on her shoulder. Then she started crying. Emma followed, both girls suddenly understanding what was happening. Helen opened her arms and they came to her, all three of them clinging together while Daniel kept watch at the door. There was no time for reunion, no time for healing. Daniel said they had maybe 30 minutes before the devotional ended. They needed. The wayward sun climbed through the upper atmosphere with alarms screaming from every system. Daniel ignored most of them, focused on the navigation display that showed 3 pursuit ships launching from New Prosperity's small spaceport. They were security vessels, faster and better armed than his mining ship. They would catch him within minutes if he tried to run in normal space. His only chance was reaching orbit and jumping to faster than light before they got close enough to disable his drive. Behind him, Helen held her daughters tight. The girls were screaming, terrified by the violent shaking of the ship and the horrible sounds of stressed metal. Sophie had her face buried in Helen's shoulder. Claire was trying to be brave, but Daniel could hear her sobbing. Emma was frozen, staring at nothing, overwhelmed by everything happening. Helen spoke to them in a constant stream, her voice cutting through the chaos. She told them to hold on, told them it would be okay, told them their mother was here and wouldn't let anything happen to them. The ship broke free of the planet's gravity well, and Daniel immediately angled toward the outer system. He needed distance from the gravity shadow before he could safely jump to faster than light. The pursuit ships were gaining, their engines more powerful than his aging mining vessel. Boone called out warnings as weapons locked onto them. Daniel threw the ship into evasive maneuvers, twisting and diving in patterns he remembered from the Colonial War. The girls screamed louder, but Daniel couldn't afford to be gentle. Being gentle meant being caught. The first weapons fire missed them by meters. Plasma bolts designed to disable engines, not destroy. New Prosperity wanted them back alive to face justice. That gave Daniel a small advantage. Ships that were trying not to kill had to be more careful with their shots. Ships that were trying to survive had no such limitations. Daniel armed the Wayward Sun's mining charges, tools designed to break apart asteroids. They weren't real weapons, but they would work in a pinch. He let one of the pursuit ships get close, waited until the last second, then dumped 3 mining charges behind him like depth charges. The charges detonated in a pattern, forcing the pursuit ship to break off or fly through the explosions. It chose to break off. 1 ship down, 2 still chasing. Daniel changed vectors again, angling toward the system's asteroid belt. If he could reach the rocks, he could use them for cover, buy himself time. Boone announced that the faster-than-light drive was charging, but needed another 4 minutes to reach safe jump parameters. 4 minutes was an eternity with armed ships on his tail. Daniel pushed the engines harder, coaxing more speed from systems that were already redlining. Behind him, Helen had stopped talking to the girls. They were all just holding on, waiting, trusting Daniel to save them. The second pursuit ship tried a different approach, swinging wide to cut off Daniel's path to the asteroid belt. It was a smart move, good tactics. Daniel responded by doing something stupid. He aimed straight at the ship instead of away from it, accelerating when he should have been dodging. The pursuit ship hesitated, confused by a target that was charging them. That hesitation gave Daniel the seconds he needed to pass within 50 meters of the enemy ship and dump his entire remaining stock of mining charges directly in their path. The charges detonated all at once. The pursuit ship's shields held but barely. It was forced to emergency stop, systems overloading from the blast. 2 ships down, 1 remaining. Daniel angled back toward his original course, the asteroid belt now within reach. The last pursuit ship followed, firing constantly, getting closer with each shot. 1 plasma bolt grazed the Wayward Sun's rear shields and everything on the ship flickered. Emergency systems kicked in, but damage indicators lit up across Daniel's console. They reached the asteroid belt with 90 seconds left on the faster-than-light drive charge. Daniel dove into the rocks, weaving between spinning chunks of ice and stone, using every bit of his piloting skill to stay ahead of the pursuit ship. The enemy was good but more cautious, not willing to risk their ship on tight maneuvers. Daniel took every risk, threading gaps that were barely wider than his ship. He scraped against one asteroid and alarms screamed about hull integrity. He ignored them and kept flying. Boone counted down the faster-than-light drive. 60 seconds. The pursuit ship tried to match Daniel's maneuvers and failed, clipping an asteroid and spinning off course. 40 seconds. Daniel found a gap between two large asteroids and pushed through, emerging on the other side of the belt with clear space ahead. 20 seconds. The pursuit ship cleared the belt behind him, damaged but still functional, still firing. 10 seconds. A plasma bolt hit their rear shields dead center and they collapsed. Another shot would hit the hull directly, would cripple them. 5 seconds. Helen grabbed Sophie and Claire and Emma as tight as she could, whispering that she loved them. 3 seconds. Daniel saw the final plasma bolt launch, saw it tracking straight for his engines. 1 second. The faster-than-light drive engaged and reality twisted. The wayward sun jumped, vanished from normal space, left Kepler 442b behind in an instant. The plasma bolt passed through empty space where they had been and kept going, traveling until its energy dissipated into nothing. In the pursuit ship, confused officers stared at empty sensors and tried to understand how their prey had escaped. Inside the wayward sun, everything was quiet except for the hum of the faster-than-light drive. Daniel sat at the controls, his hands shaking from adrenaline and relief. They had made it. Against every reasonable expectation, they had actually made it. He checked the navigation computer and saw their course plotted toward Earth. 8 days in faster-than-light space. Then they would arrive at humanity's homeworld. He left the pilot seat and went back to the cabin where Helen sat with her daughters. All 4 of them were crying now, clutching each other. The girls didn't fully understand what had happened, didn't know where they were going or why. They just knew their mother was here and they were together, and the screaming had stopped. Helen looked at Daniel with tears streaming down her face and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Daniel nodded, too tired for words. The first 2 days were difficult. The girls were traumatized and confused. Sophie wouldn't stop crying. Emma refused to speak. Claire kept asking questions that Helen didn't have good answers for. Where were they going? Why had they left? Were they in trouble? Was the man who rescued them really safe, or was this another trap? Helen did her best to explain. But how do you tell children that their entire world was built on lies? How do you explain that the place they thought was home was actually a prison? Daniel gave them space and kept the ship running. There was damage from the escape, systems that needed constant attention. The hull breach was patched but not perfect. Environmental systems ran at 90%. The faster-than-light drive made concerning noises that Boone couldn't quite diagnose, but the ship held together, kept moving, carried them steadily toward Earth. That was all that mattered. On the 3rd day, Claire came to the cockpit where Daniel was working. She stood in the doorway, uncertain. Daniel looked at her and smiled, trying to seem non-threatening. He asked if she was okay. Claire didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked if he was really taking them to Earth. Daniel said yes. She asked if Earth was really like her mother said, a place where women could do anything men could do. Daniel said yes. She asked if her mother would be safe there. Daniel promised she would be. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question she really wanted answered. She asked if Daniel was doing all this because he loved their mother. Daniel thought carefully about how to respond. He told Claire the truth. He said he cared about Helen very much, respected her strength and courage. But he was also doing this because it was right. Because children deserved their mother and mothers deserved their children. Because no one should be thrown away for something they couldn't control. Because humans were supposed to help each other and he had spent too long forgetting that. Claire seemed to accept this answer. She sat down in the co-pilot seat and watched Daniel work on the ship repairs. After a while, she started asking technical questions. How the faster-than-light drive worked. What the different systems did. Why certain things made certain sounds. Daniel answered each question patiently, showing her displays and explaining functions. Claire absorbed everything with fierce intelligence. She was smart, Daniel realized. Really smart. New Prosperity would have wasted that intelligence, would have limited her to domestic service. Earth would let her be anything she wanted. Emma opened up on the 4th day. She came to Daniel while he was in the engine room, tending the struggling faster-than-light drive. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him work. Then she asked if he had children. Daniel paused in his work, feeling old grief rise up. He said yes, he'd had a son. Emma asked where his son was now. Daniel told her his son had died in a war a long time ago. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was sorry. Daniel thanked her and they continued working in comfortable silence. Sophie remained the most frightened. She was so young, barely remembered life before the dormitories. Helen spent most of her time with Sophie, holding her, singing to her, slowly building trust. Daniel heard them sometimes through the thin walls of the ship. Helen's voice, gentle and patient. The medical frigate met them 50,000 kilometers above Earth's surface. It was sleek and white, marked with the symbols of the United Earth Medical Corps. The ship docked smoothly with the wayward sun, and Daniel felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. They were in Earth space now, under Earth's protection. New Prosperity couldn't reach them here. No one could reach them here. A medical team came aboard through the airlock, 3 people in clean uniforms who moved with practiced efficiency. The team leader was a woman named Dr. Lin Chen. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and a gentle manner. She introduced herself to Daniel first, then to Helen and the girls. She explained that they were here to help, to make sure everyone was healthy and safe. She asked permission before examining anyone, waited for consent. It was such a small thing, but Helen started crying at it. Someone asking permission, someone treating them like people who had a choice. The examination took an hour. The medical team checked everyone for injuries, malnutrition, disease. They were thorough but gentle, especially with the girls. Sophie was scared of the medical equipment, but Dr. Chen showed her how everything worked, let her hold the scanner, made it a game instead of a terror. Claire and Emma submitted to the examination with cautious cooperation. Daniel and Helen were both exhausted and malnourished, showing signs of extreme stress, but otherwise healthy. While the medical team worked, Daniel spoke with the frigate's captain, a man named Gregory Hall. Captain Hall was ex-military like Daniel, recognized the signs of combat experience. He asked about the wayward son's condition, and Daniel admitted the ship was barely holding together. The faster-than-light drive was dead, environmental systems were failing, and there were at least a dozen hull breaches poorly patched. Captain Hall nodded and said they would tow the wayward son to a repair facility. He told Daniel not to worry about costs, that Earth had programs for refugee assistance that covered this kind of thing. Representatives from the Refugee Settlement Bureau arrived while they were still aboard the medical frigate. There were 2 of them, a man named Peter Morrison and a woman named Linda Hayes. They carried data pads and official credentials, but their manner was warm and welcoming. They explained the asylum process clearly and simply. Helen and the girls would need to provide testimony about conditions in New Prosperity. There would be interviews, medical evaluations, psychological assessments. It would take time and patience, but at the end of the process, they would be granted full Earth citizenship with all the rights and protections that entailed. Helen asked what would happen if New Prosperity demanded their return. Peter Morrison's expression hardened. He said that Earth didn't recognize the authority of colonies that violated basic human rights. New Prosperity's treatment of women qualified as persecution under international law. There was 0 chance Helen or her daughters would be returned. Earth would protect them absolutely. Helen looked at Daniel with an expression of disbelief. Protection, safety, guaranteed by law and backed by the most powerful civilization humanity had ever built. It seemed too good to be true. Linda Hayes knelt down to speak with the girls at their eye level. She asked them their names and ages. She told them there were programs on Earth to help children who had experienced trauma, good schools, counselors who understood what they had been through, opportunities to learn and grow and become whoever they wanted to be. She said they would never be taken from their mother again. That was a promise Earth made and kept. Families stayed together unless there was abuse. And even then the goal was always healing and reunification when possible. Claire, still trying to be the brave older sister, asked what would happen to them right now. Where would they live? Linda explained that there was temporary housing available while they went through the asylum process. After that, they would have options. Helen could apply for permanent housing, could enroll in education or job training programs. The girls would attend school, receive therapy if they wanted it, have access to everything Earth children had access to. It wasn't charity, Linda stressed. It was a right. Every human being deserves safety, opportunity, dignity. Earth meant that literally. They were transferred to the medical frigate's passenger section and given rooms that were clean and comfortable. Real beds with soft blankets, a bathroom with hot water, a small kitchen area stocked with food. The girls explored everything with wide eyes. Sophie found a stuffed animal someone had left on her bed, a soft blue bear. She clutched it like a lifeline. Emma discovered that the windows could show different views of Earth, zooming in on oceans and mountains and cities. Claire found a data pad with access to Earth's educational networks and started reading immediately. Helen stood in the middle of their assigned room and looked around like she was in a museum. Daniel understood. This was what normal looked like. This was what life could be when people weren't being crushed by cruelty, dressed up as righteousness. He left Helen and the girls to rest and went to his own assigned room. It was smaller but equally comfortable. He lay down on the bed, the first real bed he had slept in since leaving his mountain, and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He was too wired, too aware that they had actually made it. Against every reasonable expectation, they were here. They were safe. Over the next 3 days, they descended to Earth. The medical frigate brought them to an orbital station first, a massive structure that housed tens of thousands of people. The girls pressed their faces to windows and stared at the crowds of humans from 100 different worlds, speaking dozens of languages, living and working together in relative peace. This was humanity at its best, complex and chaotic but fundamentally committed to letting people be people. From the orbital station, they took a shuttle down to Earth's surface. The descent was smooth and carefully controlled, nothing like the violent escape from Kepler 442b. The shuttle landed at a spaceport in North America, a facility so large it could have held New Prosperity's entire colony twice over. There were ships coming and going constantly, a river of traffic connecting Earth to the stars. Helen held her daughters close and cried quietly, overwhelmed by the scale of everything. They were met at the spaceport by more representatives from the Refugee Settlement Bureau. These ones had prepared a whole orientation program. They provided Helen and the girls with identification credentials, temporary but official. They gave them spending credits for basic necessities. They explained transportation systems, communication networks, legal rights. It was a lot of information delivered quickly, but the representatives were patient, willing to repeat anything that wasn't clear. The girls were fascinated by everything. The crowds of people, the variety of clothing and appearance, the technology that was so much more advanced than anything in New Prosperity. Emma asked why everyone looked so different from each other. The representative explaining this was a young woman named Grace, who smiled and said that Earth valued diversity. People came from everywhere, brought their cultures and traditions mixed and evolved. It made humanity stronger, more creative, better able to solve problems. Difference was good, not something to fear or suppress. They were taken to a residential facility in what used to be called Oregon, on the coast where forests met ocean. The facility housed about 200 refugee families from various colonies, all people who had fled persecution or war. There were counselors on staff, teachers, legal advocates, medical professionals, everything someone might need to rebuild their life. Helen and the girls were given an apartment, small but complete. 2 bedrooms, a living area, a kitchen, a bathroom, windows that looked out over the Pacific Ocean. Sophie saw the ocean for the first time and asked what it was. Helen knelt beside her and explained about Earth's vast waters, how life had begun there, how the oceans covered most of the planet. Sophie asked if they could go see it up close. Helen said yes, they could. They could do anything they wanted now. That was what freedom meant. Daniel was given accommodations in an adjacent building, close enough to help if needed, but separate to give Helen and her family space. He spent the first few days just existing, letting his mind adjust to not being in danger. He walked along the beach and felt sand under his boots. He listened to waves and tried to remember the last time he had heard natural water. He watched the sun set over the Pacific and thought about Marcus, who would have loved this, who should have had the chance to see this. Helen came to find him on the 4th evening. She left the girls with a counselor who was showing them educational programs and walked down to where Daniel stood watching the ocean. They were quiet for a long time, just standing together. Then Helen said she had completed her initial asylum interviews. The representatives had been shocked by her testimony about New Prosperity. Apparently, there had been rumors about the colony's practices, but no confirmed reports. Helen's story was the first direct evidence. Earth's Colonial Oversight Committee was already discussing sanctions and intervention. Daniel asked if that scared her, the attention her case was getting. Helen shook her head. She said it felt good to be heard, to have someone listen and believe and care. She said the counselors were already helping, that the girls were responding well to therapy. Claire was reading at a level years beyond. 3 months after their arrival on Earth, Helen stood in front of a classroom filled with other refugees and told her story. It was part of her training to become a trauma counselor. This sharing of experience with others who had fled persecution. She spoke about new prosperity, about the casting out, about stumbling through ice fields wearing nothing but shame. She told them about Daniel finding her, about choosing to save her daughters, about the desperate flight to Earth. Her voice was steady now, stronger than it had been. The pain was still there, but it no longer owned her. When she finished, a woman in the back row raised her hand. She was from a different colony, had fled religious persecution. She asked Helen how she had found the courage to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. Helen thought about the question carefully before answering. She said courage wasn't something you found. It was something you chose. Every single day you woke up and chose to keep moving forward, even when forward seemed impossible. You chose it for yourself, for the people you loved, for the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. Courage was just hope with teeth. The girls were thriving in their own ways. Claire had tested into advanced classes at the refugee center's school and was working on mathematics and engineering principles that would have been forbidden to her in New Prosperity. Her teachers said she had a natural gift for understanding systems, for seeing how pieces fit together. She wanted to design starships someday, wanted to build vessels that would carry people safely between the stars. When Daniel heard about this dream, he took her to a shipyard and showed her real engineers at work. Claire watched them with absolute focus, absorbing everything, already planning her future. Emma had discovered art in a way that transformed her entire being. She painted and drew constantly, creating images of Earth's oceans and forests, of faces she saw, of memories both painful and beautiful. Her therapist said the art was helping Emma process trauma, giving her a language for feelings she couldn't speak. The refugee center's art teacher was impressed by Emma's work, said she had real talent, encouraged her to keep creating. Emma had started small, hesitant to believe anyone would value what she made. Now her room was covered in drawings and paintings, a riot of color and emotion. Sophie was the youngest and had changed the most. She laughed now easily and often. She had made friends with other children at the refugee center, played games that involved running and shouting and joy. Her nightmares were becoming less frequent. She was learning to trust that safety was real, that adults could be kind, that the world held more good than harm. Sometimes she still woke up crying, asking for her mother. Helen was always there, holding her, promising that nothing would separate them again. And slowly, Sophie was beginning to believe it. Daniel spent his days helping the Colonial Oversight Committee prepare their case against New Prosperity. His testimony was valuable because he understood both the colony's layout and its psychology. He explained how isolation bred extremism, how small communities without outside contact could twist themselves into shapes that barely resembled humanity. The committee was building toward intervention, toward offering New Prosperity citizens the choice to leave, to seek sanctuary on Earth. It was delicate work, complicated by questions of sovereignty and jurisdiction, but it was important work. Work that might save others like Helen. In the evenings, Daniel often had dinner with Helen and the girls. It had started as occasional but became routine, this gathering around Helen's small kitchen table. They talked about their days, about what they had learned, about plans for the future. The conversations were easy now, comfortable. The girls treated Daniel like family, not quite a father, but something close. An uncle maybe, a guardian, someone who cared about them and whose presence made them feel safe. One night after dinner, while the girls were doing homework in their rooms, Helen asked Daniel if he was happy. It was a simple question but loaded with meaning. Daniel thought about it carefully. He told Helen he wasn't sure happiness was the right word. He felt purposeful. He felt connected. He felt like his life meant something again. Maybe that was better than happiness. Maybe that was enough. Helen smiled and said she understood. She felt the same way. There was still pain, still grief for the years stolen from her and her daughters. But there was also joy. There was possibility. She was learning who she was without New Prosperity's definitions. She was becoming someone new, someone built from her own choices rather than someone else's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The wayward sun was finally repaired after 8 weeks in the shipyard. Daniel went to see it when the work was complete. The ship looked better than it had in years. Systems upgraded, hull reinforced, the faster-than-light drive completely rebuilt. The shipyard foreman said it would run for another 50 years easy. Daniel stood in the cockpit and felt strange. This ship had been his escape, his way of running from grief. Now it was just a vessel, metal and circuits with no emotional weight. He didn't need to run anymore. He talked to Peter Morrison about what to do with the ship. Peter suggested donating it to the Refugee Assistance Program. There were other people trapped on colonies like New Prosperity, other families who needed extraction. The wayward sun could serve that purpose, could become part of a fleet dedicated to rescue operations. Daniel agreed immediately. It felt right, transforming his escape into someone else's salvation. Helen's asylum case was approved on a Tuesday morning in October. She received the notification on her datapad and just stared at it for several minutes. Official Earth citizenship, granted to her and all 3 daughters. Full legal rights, full protections under law. They could stay anywhere they wanted, work any job they qualified for, live their lives without fear of deportation or persecution. It was over. They were home in the truest sense. Helen called Daniel immediately and he came to her apartment. They stood together in the kitchen while the girls were at school and Helen cried. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. She had been carrying fear for so long that putting it down left her feeling unsteady. Daniel held her while she cried and told her it was okay. She was allowed to feel everything, to let it all out. After a while, Helen stopped crying and started laughing, almost giddy with the reality of freedom. They celebrated that night, all 5 of them going to a restaurant in the nearby town. It was the first time the girls had eaten in a public restaurant, the first time they had been surrounded by strangers who weren't threatening. Sophie was nervous at first, but relaxed when she saw how normal everyone was. Claire ordered something called pizza and declared it the greatest food ever invented. Emma spent the whole meal drawing the restaurant and the people in it, capturing moments of casual humanity. Helen watched her daughters laugh and talk and exist without fear, and she felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. After dinner, they walked along the beach in the darkness. The ocean was loud and vast, and the stars overhead were brilliant. Daniel pointed out Kepler 442b, just a point of light among millions. He told the girls that was where they came from, where their journey had started. Sophie asked if they would ever go back. Helen said no, never. Claire asked if other people were still trapped there. Daniel said yes, probably. But Earth was working on that, trying to help. Emma, quiet until now, said something that made everyone stop walking. She said she hoped someone like Daniel found those people, someone who would see them as human, who would risk everything to save them, someone who would whisper that they would take them home and then actually do it, because that was what heroes did. They kept their promises. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just been a lonely man who found someone in the ice and decided not to leave her there. But maybe that was what heroism was. Maybe it wasn't about grand gestures or perfect virtue. Maybe it was just about choosing to help when helping was hard, choosing to act when inaction was easier, choosing to care when caring hurt. Helen took his hand and they continued walking. The girls ran ahead, playing in the sand, their voices carrying back on the wind. Above them, ships moved through the night sky, traveling between Earth and the colonies. Some of those ships were now part of the Refugee Assistance Fleet, including the Wayward Sun. They would go to other Kepler 442b's, other New Prosperities, and they would offer sanctuary to anyone who needed it. They would be the answer to desperate prayers whispered in ice fields and prisons and places where hope had almost died. The Colonial Oversight Committee announced their intervention plan 2 weeks later. They would send diplomatic missions to New Prosperity and similar colonies, offering resources and integration with Earth's broader society. They would make it clear that anyone who wanted to leave would be welcomed. They would establish monitoring systems to ensure human rights were respected. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be fast, but it was a start. It was humanity remembering that every person mattered, even people on the edge of nowhere. Helen was asked to speak at the public announcement. She stood at a podium in front of news cameras from across Earth and the colonies, and she told her story again. This time it reached millions of people. This time it sparked conversations about how humanity. 6 months after arriving on Earth, Helen stood in front of her own house for the first time. It wasn't large or fancy, just a small structure in the coastal mountains of Oregon overlooking the Pacific. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area with windows that framed the ocean like a painting. The house was hers, purchased with assistance from the refugee settlement program and her own savings from her work as a counselor trainee. It was the first thing she had ever owned that couldn't be taken away by someone else's decision. The girls ran through the empty rooms, their voices echoing off bare walls. Sophie claimed the smallest bedroom because it had a window seat where she could read. Emma wanted the room with the best light for painting. Claire took the room closest to the kitchen, already planning where she would set up her engineering study materials. They were claiming space, building territory, acting like children who believed they would be allowed to stay. Helen watched them and felt her chest tighten with emotion she couldn't name. Daniel's house was next door, close enough that he could walk over in less than a minute. It was even smaller than Helen's, just 2 bedrooms and basic amenities. He didn't need much space, didn't accumulate possessions, but it had a workshop where he could tinker with equipment and a porch that looked out over the mountains where he took his morning coffee. It was more home than the mountain station had ever been, because this time he had chosen to stay rather than hide. Over the following weeks they moved in properly. Furniture arrived, donated, and purchased. Helen and the girls picked out colors for the walls, choosing brightness over the gray that had defined new prosperity. They hung pictures in shelves and slowly transformed empty space into home. Daniel helped with the heavy work, assembling furniture and installing fixtures. The girls followed him around asking questions, learning how things worked, treating him like a beloved uncle who had all the answers. Helen enrolled in the final phase of her counseling certification program. She had already completed months of training, had worked with dozens of other refugees, had learned how to help people process trauma without being consumed by it. The work was hard but meaningful. Every person she helped felt like defiance against everything New Prosperity had tried to teach her. Every life she touched was proof that she had value beyond what they had tried to destroy. Her specialization was helping women who had fled gender-based persecution. She understood their stories from the inside, knew what it felt like to be reduced to your reproductive capacity. She could sit with their pain without flinching because she had survived the same pain. And she could show them that survival was possible, that the damage wasn't permanent, that they could build lives worth living on the other side of hell. The girls started regular school in the local district, integrating with Earth children who had never known persecution or exile. It was hard at first. They were behind in some subjects, ahead in others, and carried trauma that their classmates couldn't understand. But children are resilient, and teachers on Earth were trained to help refugee students. Slowly, Claire and Emma and Sophie found their rhythms, made friends, discovered interests, started to imagine futures that didn't involve fear. Claire joined a robotics club and discovered she loved building things with her hands as much as understanding them in theory. She was good at it too, intuitive about how mechanical systems fit together. Her team won a regional competition and Claire stood on stage accepting a trophy with a smile that transformed her entire face. Helen watched from the audience and cried, thinking about how New Prosperity would have wasted this brilliant girl, would have relegated her to domestic service and child rearing. Earth let her be everything she could become. Emma's art caught the attention of a local gallery owner who specialized in work by emerging artists. She offered Emma a show, a small exhibition of her paintings and drawings. Emma was terrified by the idea of strangers seeing her work, but Helen encouraged her to try. The show opened on a Saturday in March and dozens of people came. They bought her paintings, asked about her techniques, told her she had real talent. Emma glowed with pride and disbelief. Someone valued what she created. Someone thought her vision of the world was worth preserving. Sophie's transformation was the most dramatic because she had been so young when they left New Prosperity. She barely remembered the colony, had no real context for how different her life was now. She just knew she was happy. She had friends who came over to play. She had a mother who hugged her every day. She had space to be loud and messy and childish. She was learning that the world was safe, that adults could be trusted, that tomorrow would probably be okay. These were gifts beyond price. Daniel found his own rhythm too. He worked part-time with the refugee assistance fleet, helping coordinate rescue operations remotely. His experience with New Prosperity made him valuable for planning extractions from other authoritarian colonies. He studied their layouts, identified security weaknesses, developed strategies that would minimize risk to refugees and rescue teams. It was satisfying work, knowing that his skills were saving lives, that every successful extraction was someone else getting the chance Helen had gotten. He also started teaching at the refugee center, sharing his engineering and piloting knowledge with other refugees who wanted to work in space industries. Many of his students were women from colonies that had restricted their education. They absorbed everything Daniel taught them with fierce dedication, making up for years of denied opportunity. Watching them learn, watching them grow confident in their abilities reminded Daniel why humanity's commitment to equality mattered. Talent was distributed equally, only opportunity was not. In the evenings, Daniel often had dinner at Helen's house. It had become routine, expected. The girls set a place for him without being asked. Helen cooked meals that were slowly becoming more ambitious as she learned Earth cuisine. They talked about their days, about struggles and victories, about plans and dreams. It was domestic and ordinary and precious. It was family, even if they didn't use that word. One night after dinner, Daniel was helping Sophie with her homework while Helen cleaned up and Claire and Emma were reading in their rooms. Sophie was working on a writing assignment, an essay about someone who had helped her. She asked Daniel how to spell hero. Daniel spelled it for her and asked who she was writing about. Sophie said she was writing about him, about how he had saved her mother and then saved her and her sisters, about how he had taken them all home even though it was dangerous. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He told Sophie he wasn't really a hero. He had just done what anyone should do. Sophie looked at him with the absolute certainty that only children possess. She said that was what made him a hero. He had done the right thing when it was hard. That was what heroes were, people who helped when helping hurt. Daniel didn't have words for that, so he just hugged her and helped her finish her homework. Helen's counseling practice officially opened in May. She rented a small office in town and began seeing clients referred through the Refugee Assistance Network. Her schedule filled quickly. There were so many people who needed help, so many refugees carrying trauma that Earth's general counselors didn't fully understand. Helen understood. She had lived it. That understanding made her uniquely effective at helping others heal. She specialized in helping her clients rebuild their sense of self-worth. So many refugees from authoritarian colonies had been taught they were worthless, that their value was conditional on meeting impossible standards. Helen knew that lie intimately, had believed it herself once. Now she helped others see through it. She taught them that their humanity was inherent, not earned, that they deserved respect and dignity just for existing, that they were enough exactly as they were. Word of her practice spread through the refugee community. Soon Helen was being asked to speak at conferences, to train other counselors, to write about her approaches. She was becoming an expert in her field, recognized and respected. The woman who had been cast out as worthless was now teaching others how to recognize worth. The symmetry was almost poetic. Daniel and Helen's relationship deepened into something neither of them had quite expected. They weren't romantic exactly, but they were intimate in ways that mattered more than romance. They knew each other's pain and healing, had survived impossible things together, had built trust that went bone deep. They were partners in the truest sense, family. Whatever label fit, it was real and it was enough. On the anniversary of their arrival on Earth, they gathered at the beach for a celebration. Helen brought cake and the girls brought joy. They built a fire as the sun set and sat around it talking about the year that had passed, about how far they had come, how much they had grown, about the life they were building here, rooted in freedom and possibility. Claire talked about her plans to apply to Earth's Space Engineering Academy. Emma talked about her upcoming art show in a bigger gallery. Sophie just talked about her friends and her school and her life, oblivious to how miraculous her normalcy was. Helen talked about her expanding practice, about the people she was helping. Daniel talked about the successful extractions the refugee fleet had completed, about the families now safe on Earth because someone had taken the risk.